event, as you know, is really sponsored by both the Middle Eastern Studies program and as well as PARC. So I know some of you are coming from one, some of the others, so thank you again for coming. And we felt it was important again to combine our efforts to bring in our speaker, Khalil Shikaki, who will be speaking about Palestinian and Israeli relations. Is peace viable? Obviously an important topic. I have a short bio to present, and then we'll begin. As many of you know, Dr. Shikaki is an associate professor of political science and director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in Ramallah. And he, as well as the center, are well known because he has conducted more than 150 polls among Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And his work from those polls is, of course, very, very well known. Professor Shikaki is also, right now, a senior fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University, and we were just talking about a wonderful course that he has been teaching there. He finished his PhD in political science from Columbia in 1985, taught at several universities, including Birzeit, Al-Najjar National University, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, University of South Florida. He spent summer of 2002 as a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington. I mentioned that since 1993 he's conducted more than 150 polls. He's written a number of books on Palestinian politics. His most recent publication is Palestinian and Israeli Public Opinion with Yaakov Shamir, Indiana University Press, 2010. So please join me in welcoming Professor Shikaki.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. The topic that I was asked to speak on is the Arab or the Palestinian-Israeli peace process, a subject that I like to talk about. But if any of you is here for some optimism about the conflict, I'm probably not the right person for that. Although I have a very optimistic long-term view of where this conflict is heading, I have a somewhat bleak short-term expectation about where this conflict is heading. So now that I have told you the bad news, I can start by giving you some good news. And the good news is, given the 100 years of conflict, and even the last decade of the conflict, we have never been in a better position to make peace as we are today. How could that be? Well, let's just look at the last decade. Little over 10 years ago, we had Camp David. That failed. It failed for various reasons. Some at the international level, some at the domestic level, and perhaps something had to do with the leaders themselves. If I were just to look at these three drivers, I would say today we're in good shape. The Obama administration decided to engage from day one, unlike the Clinton administration, which waited until the last 6 months of the administration to bring the parties together. So the administration is certainly committed to playing a role very early on, learning from the lessons from the Clinton administration as well as the Bush years, who decided also not to engage until it was his last year in office or so. At Camp David, if you recall, the Israeli and Arab and the Palestinian leaders were isolated for 2 weeks. They actually, at least on the Palestinian side, Arafat couldn't talk to any of the Arab leaders. Somehow the Clinton administration believed that Arafat can make far-reaching decisions and compromises without consulting with the Egyptians or the Saudis or the Jordanians. This idea today that could happen, of course, is not acceptable. If you look today at the extent to which there is a level of Arabization for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the comparison between where we are today and where we were then in 2000 is great. There is much greater Arab involvement. There is an Arab initiative for peace between all the Arab states and Israel as an outcome of ending the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians and Israel and Syria. And there is a much greater international involvement. There is, in fact, an agency called the Quartet that deals with issues related to the peace process, focused almost entirely on Israeli-Palestinian peace process. So the international community is fully involved, unlike the case during Camp David. So we're doing much better at the international level than we did at Camp David. If we look at the domestic environment for the Palestinians, I would say we are actually today better than we were then. There are some problems with the domestic environment, but there were more problems at that time. On the Palestinian side, the performance of the Palestinian institutions, public institutions, including the security services, today are much better than they were at the time of Camp David in 2000. The extent of law and order, the enforcement of at least order in Palestinian areas is much better than it was in 2000. Economic conditions are improving in the West Bank, not in Gaza, but in the West Bank. Hamas probably had more credibility and support in 2000 than it has today, even though it won the elections in January 2006. Hamas's violent takeover of Gaza had done significant damage to the credibility of the organization. The use of force against other Palestinians, threatening a very important Palestinian national ethos, has also contributed to weakening Hamas and its ability to block any peace agreement. Palestinian public support for compromise today is greater than it has been at any other time since the start of the peace process. At the time of Camp David, and the immediate aftermath, when the Clinton parameters, for example, in December of that year were presented, public support for compromise at that time was much less than it is today. There's a majority of Palestinians today, greater majority, that supports the two-state solution and supports the major compromises required for reaching the two-state solution. In 2000, Arafat was leading, and he certainly did have the legacy of the PLO, and as a founding father of the Palestinian national movement, he had a great deal of credibility. But Fatah was much more fragmented, Fatah behind him. The backbone of the Palestinian nationalist movement was much weaker and fragmented than it is today. The young guard of the nationalist movement, who had the legitimacy in the street, were not controlling the institutions. Today they are controlling the institutions of Fatah. They are in control. Fatah was able in 2009 to hold its 6th Congress, which allowed it to elect a new leadership, kicking out the old guard almost completely, and installing young God leaders. So the institutions of Fatah, and these are the first institutions that would have to look at any decision regarding peace with Israel, are real institutions as compared to the institutions of Fatah that prevailed in 2000. On the Israeli side, and then of course, let me just say something about Abbas as well. Arafat did have the legacy, but most Israelis did not trust him. And by the time he went to Camp David, most Palestinians didn't like him. His popularity, while at Camp David, has plummeted to less than 35%. His popularity stood at more than 75% when the Palestinian Authority was first established. If we compare Abbas, Abu Mazen, the current president of the Palestinian Authority, the chairman of the PLO, and with all previous Palestinian leaders, from Haj Amin Husseini to Ahmad Shuqairi to Yasser Arafat, he is probably the one most perceived by Palestinians and Israelis as a man of peace, a man who would do anything to reach a peace agreement with Israel, someone who would oppose violence very, very effectively, unlike Arafat, who wavered at times. Arafat actually believed that violence is an instrument of policy. Abu Mazen doesn't. Abu Mazen believes violence is fatal in Israeli-Palestinian relationship. That wasn't Arafat's thinking. And for that, the Israelis didn't trust Arafat much, the Israeli public. And of course, Abu Mazen is fighting Hamas, an organization that the Israelis now define as the one that wants to destroy the state of Israel and so on. So Abu Mazen seems to be the right person in the right place. So you have a domestic environment that is conducive, a leadership and an international environment. And in the Israeli side, you have an Israeli coalition in government that represents mostly the right wing. But if it decides it wants to make peace with the Palestinians, it automatically, even if they are not part of the coalition, will support that decision. So both Kadima and the Arab parties on the left, the center and left, will support any decision by the Likud and Labour with regard to the peace process. If the Israeli leadership decides to go for an agreement with the Palestinians, Israeli public opinion has also moved in a significant way since Camp David in 2000 towards showing much greater willingness to compromise than it did at that time. And of course, the strategic environment of Israel is much greater, much better now than it was in 2000. Since then, Iraq has been removed as a threat, so the Israelis can afford to withdraw from the West Bank and to allow some other security arrangements to be placed in that area. And the Iranian threat that has emerged is one that is shared with those Israel wants to make peace with. So it's a kind of threat that drives peace, not the other way around. So why do things look bleak then, if things look so good? There's a joke about Israelis. And a CNN reporter finds an Israeli in the street and he asks him, in one word, tell us about the conditions in Israel. And the Israelis say, in one word? This is CNN. It has to be just one word. And the Israelis say, good. And the CNN man doesn't like it and say, what if I give you 2 words? It's not good. Why is it not good? Well, despite the involvement of the U.S. administration, we're discovering that mere involvement is not the answer, that the U.S. needs to use leverage. And this administration, probably like most other administrations before it, is not prepared to use leverage. And this is true, by the way, on both. It is not just that the administration is not willing to use leverage against the Israelis. It is also unwilling to use leverage against the Palestinians. There are various reasons. Not for Israel, it's mostly domestic. For the Palestinians, it's regional, it's Arab. Any attempt to sanction the Palestinians would mean the whole idea that the Obama administration had been trying to promote, which is one that says, let's improve our image and our relationship with the Arab and Muslim world, would be negatively affected. And if he tries to pressure Israel, there is enough lobby, not just from the organized Jewish community, but also from the Republicans and from some of the most religious communities that see Israel in biblical terms, define it and its future in biblical terms. And they are not going to stand still and allow the administration to pressure Israel. So leverage is out. The administration can offer its good offices, but if there are no takers, Washington seems useless. And for the Palestinians in particular, Washington has been a big disappointment. Obama's Washington has been a big disappointment. Obama starts, Palestinians believe, on the right track with focusing on settlements and declaring the illegitimacy of the settlements and the settlement enterprise, and any continuation of settlements is a real threat, something that goes well with the Palestinian narrative about settlements. Then he abandons it overnight, and the Palestinians feel the shock almost overnight. Then the administration succeeds in getting the Israelis to declare a moratorium for a limited period, 10 months, in a partial freeze, and invites the Palestinians for proximity talks. So Palestinians go and sit in these proximity talks. The last time that the president of the Palestinian Authority, Abbas, was here meeting with the Obama administration was last May, and they were still talking about proximity talks, and proximity talks were officially still going on. And the president meets with Obama in the White House and comes out of the meeting very happy with the outcome, basically saying he and the president see eye to eye 100% of the issues. Why? Because the president has asked the Palestinians to present their views as part of the Mitchell mission, and the Palestinians present their views about permanent status. They give a very detailed outline of what they will accept in any peace agreement with the Israelis. And what the Palestinians present is the most moderate view that they have ever presented in negotiations. And it's a comprehensive one. It's not just one about borders or two-state solution. It's about borders, security, refugees, Jerusalem, everything. So basically the Palestinians say, look, this is what we have done with the Israelis so far. This is the outcome of all the negotiations we've conducted, including the latest before that, before the last proximity talks, which is the talks with the previous Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert. And the Palestinians actually make further concessions on what they present to Mitchell and the American administration. And so the Americans have nothing else to ask the Palestinians. And a week later, everything collapses. A week later, the administration says, we've stopped proximity talks. We're now going into direct talks. There will be no more proximity talks. Direct talks. the topic that did not even come up a week before, in a meeting between the president of the Palestinian Authority and the administration. And the Palestinians are shocked. What happened in a week? One thing happened. Netanyahu visited the president that day when the president decided to announce the end of the proximity talks and the focus on the direct talks. Then the Palestinians are shocked, and once again they lose confidence in the administration. But thirdly, when the president then sends Mitchell to meet, when the U.S. president sends Mitchell to meet with the Palestinians after that decision, and he comes to Ramallah, the president asks him, has the Israelis, he says the proximity talks are over, and he says, well, at least has the Israelis presented you with an outline of their position, similar to the one we presented you? Perhaps you can share that with us. And Mitchell tells him, no. The Israelis have not given us anything. So the Palestinians are saying, how come you pressed us to present you our ideas and not press the Israelis? They said, we did, but the Israelis were not forthcoming. And for the Palestinians, the idea that the mere outline of positions is something that the administration did not have the capacity to press the Israelis on, to use some level of leverage at least, to get the Israelis to talk about these issues, was also shocking. For these reasons, there is tremendous disillusionment in Ramallah. Of course, given the outcome of the elections, this disillusionment will now be deepened. However, this is not the only reason why things are bleak. The Palestinians strongly believe that there is no peace process without strong American intervention. They are learning that this American intervention is not forthcoming. And therefore, they are asking themselves, so what happens? What do we do? If the peace process is dead in the sense that, as far as the U.S. is concerned, there is no expectation of a strong American intervention, something that is supported fully by the public. The public, even though it believes the U.S. is fully biased in favor of Israel, still wants the U.S. In these negotiations. Now, the second change that I think the Palestinians are looking at is the changes they see in Israel. And that is certainly pushing them in the direction of looking for alternatives. The Palestinians believe three things have changed in Israel during the last year or so. First of all, they had early on a right-wing Israeli government. The right-wing Israeli government, the coalition, is perceived by the Palestinians as one that will only complicate matters because it will add new demands that have not been raised before. It will harden its position regarding things that have already been raised and have already been addressed. And of course, they are worried about that. Most significantly, for example, the question of the demand that the Palestinians recognize the Jewish nature of the state. This is something for the Palestinians. For the Israelis, this is a natural thing. Israel is a Jewish state, so why can't the Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state? What is wrong with the Palestinians? For Palestinians, they say, well, you've made peace with Egypt and Jordan, did not ask them to recognize the state of Israel as a Jewish state. We have made some progress in the peace process with you at Oslo and then at Camp David, and you didn't even, at Camp David, the whole issue of Jewish nature of the state was not raised. Why are you raising it now? Because you are the first right-wing government to negotiate with us. This is indeed a first. In the history of Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, Palestinians negotiated with Rabin. Then Netanyahu came and nothing came out of it. But there was no negotiations on permanent status issues with him. With Rabin, there was no negotiations also on permanent status. But the first permanent status negotiations Palestinians had were with Barak, Ehud Barak, again, a head of labor. And then with Kadima and Ehud Olmert, again, the center. And the center and the left. at that time. But this is the first time that this is a right-wing coalition based on right-wing votes in the Israeli Knesset. And it adds to the complication, because not only because of the demands, but because Netanyahu says, the Israeli Prime Minister says to the Palestinians, I'm negotiating in good faith. I know this coalition that I have cannot make peace. He admits to that. But he says, the minute we reach an agreement, I'll change this coalition, bring a new coalition that will be willing to approve any peace agreement I reach with you. That is also a first, by the way. This is the first time that the Palestinians are being asked to negotiate with a coalition, with a government that is not going to be the one that will actually sign on the agreement reached. For the Palestinians, the implication of that is, if you want Netanyahu, want to remain the leader of the right wing, and do not want to change your coalition in order to enter peace negotiations, you will be spending your time while we are negotiating trying to appease your right-wing coalition partners, because in order for them to just merely allow you to negotiate a peace agreement with us. There is no support for concessions you'll be making, but it's support for the mere negotiations. And that could mean, therefore, a huge settlement enterprise, decisions on expanding the settlement enterprise and so on. And that is why, for example, the election of Netanyahu compelled the Palestinians to raise the issue of the settlements and the need for freeze, because of the expectation that the right-wing government, first and foremost, will go in that direction, and that the Palestinians need to preempt that drive towards expanding the settlement enterprise. There is a third problem that Palestinians see when they look at the changes in Israel during the last couple of years, and that is that the Israeli public, while indeed becoming more willing to compromise, doesn't really care much about the peace process. As far as the Israeli man in the street is concerned, Israel already has peace. The level of peace and quiet that prevails in Israel today is unprecedented. Even during the best days of the peace process, there hasn't been the kind of security cooperation between Palestinians and Israelis that we have today. Israelis are enjoying the benefits of peace without having to make concessions, without having to reach an agreement with the Palestinians. So what are the implications of that for Palestinians? Well, the implication is Netanyahu risks nothing by not reaching any agreement. There is no demand for an agreement. He can simply waste time as much as he wants. The Palestinians expect Abu Mazen to deliver an agreement. So the risks for him, if he fails, the risks for him and for Fatah is great, because that's net benefit for Hamas. Hamas gains, he loses, he and Fatah lose. And therefore, as in terms of the balance of risks, the Israelis are not taking any, Palestinians believe, and Palestinians are taking a lot. By merely negotiating with a right-wing coalition that they know, strongly believe, cannot make peace, there's a profound distrust of Netanyahu and the right-wing coalition in Israel. And there is disbelief that Netanyahu would be willing to change this coalition at any time in the near future in order to reach peace with the Palestinians. Okay. So the problem with the administration is a very serious problem, creating the kind of disillusionment in the role of the U.S., given the background that the Palestinians believe that there will be no progress unless the administration uses its leverage. There is, of course, these changes in Israel are causing the Palestinians significant concern about Israel's willingness to take risks for peace, and forcing the Palestinians to think about alternatives, which is what I will turn to in a minute. unlike previous negotiations, Palestinians this time around are considering the day after. In previous negotiations, Palestinians did not deliberately consider the day after if things did not go the way they hope they would go. Why is that so? Why are the Palestinians now more concerned about what happens next? Why are they thinking beforehand about their options afterwards if negotiations fail? For two reasons. Both are domestic. One is the concern about violence. Contrary to the prevailing perception among most Israelis, the Palestinian leadership, the current Palestinian leadership at least, does not believe that the eruption of violence after the Camp David in 2000 was intentional. The current Palestinian leadership believes that the violence that came in during the Second Intifada was the unintended consequence of the failure of Camp David, that it was not planned, deliberate, etc., by any Palestinian leader. But they do very sincerely believe that it was the natural outcome of failure at Camp David, and they want to avoid that happening one more time. Abu Mazen, as I indicated earlier, believes that violence is fatal to Palestinian interests, and that Palestinians should do their utmost to avoid a situation where the only option they have is to resort to violence, and that therefore they must have other options before they go to violence, if they ever do go to violence. In that, the Palestinian leadership actually has public support. Majority of Palestinians today are opposed to return to violence and return to the violent intifada, the second intifada. Most Palestinians today, contrary to where they were 5 years ago, most Palestinians today do not believe that if Palestinians resort to violence, it will serve their national interest in ways that negotiations cannot. That is not what Palestinians believe today about violence. And so the Palestinian leadership has legitimacy in rejecting violence at this stage. But the Palestinian leadership knows that there is another alternative it wants to avoid if it were not to seek violence, or if it were not to allow violence to erupt. And that is, surprisingly, reconciliation with Hamas. Unlike the prevailing perception again in Israel, which says, and in fact in Washington I've discovered recently, there is some concern in Washington that Abu Mazen might be looking into reconciliation with Hamas. It is my view that he is far away from doing that, and that in fact he's looking for options in order to avoid a situation whereby he is forced to seek reconciliation with Hamas as a way of building some legitimacy for himself, knowing that his own term has ended and he is no longer able to remain president based on electoral legitimacy. So the Palestinian leadership basically says most likely negotiations will fail. They might not even resume. And we want to avoid violence, which could be the natural outcome, and therefore we need to stop it. And we don't want to be pushed to the corner by public demand to reconcile with Hamas. So we need to do something else. And the something else is the various strategies that the Palestinians are looking at. And these strategies, which do not include violence, which do not include reconciliation with Hamas, include 4 additional elements or other elements. Number one is what Abu Mazen is doing now in the Arab world, what you can call return to Arabization. Return to Arabization means that the Palestinian leadership presents the Arab world with the problems confronting Palestinians and say to them, what do you think we should do? Now, this goes contrary to what the Palestinian nationalist movement has been trying to do since the 60s. Since the founding of the Palestinian nationalist movement, the Palestinians have sought independence of decision. This was considered a most sacred value for Palestinians, that we shouldn't allow conditions to materialize similar to those that materialized just before the 1948 war, where the Arab countries made decisions, the Arab countries invaded, the Arab countries did what they did in order to serve their own interests, and the Palestinians paid the price. So Palestinians have been focusing on building their own capacity to make their own decision-making. And what we see today, Abu Mazen going to Cairo, hoping that Arabs will make decisions for him. Why is he doing that? Well, he's doing it for two reasons. One domestic and one not so domestic. The not so domestic has to do with Obama. Obama, remember what I said earlier. Obama says, I want to improve relations with the Arab and Muslim world. Palestinians say, that's very good. Well, we Palestinians are part of the Arab world, but it's easy for Obama to neglect us. Because if he is able to win the rest of the Arab world, we can be neglected. But if our decision is in fact the decision of the Arab world, then Obama cannot ignore it. We are thereby raising the costs for neglect, an American neglect of the issues, or American decision to go against the wishes of the Arab world. That's one reason why the Palestinian president seeks Arabization. There is another reason that is domestic, and that is Abu Mazen seeks Arab support against Hamas. If the Arab world makes decisions framed in Abu Mazen's terms, and the Arab world deals with or views the Abu Mazen and the Palestinian nationalist movement as the only legitimate interlocutor, then that marginalizes Hamas further. And Abu Mazen hopes that since he comes to them voluntarily and asks for their support, something that Hamas wouldn't do, that this will keep the Arab world from running after Hamas and will keep the Arab world glued to him and to his national movement. This is Arabization. And of course, Abu Mazen thinks it doesn't take away Palestinian decision-making, because it's something that he and the Palestinian nationalist movement can stop at any time they want. And therefore, he doesn't see the risks of putting Palestinian decisions in the hand of the Arab world, at least for the short term. The second element of the strategy is internationalization. And that brings in a whole list of issues of what can be done at the international level. The most important for that is to go to the UN Security Council, ask the UN Security Council to demand Israel stop settlement construction. Israel doesn't stop. Comes back to the UN Security Council and says, censure Israel for not doing so. Okay, maybe yes, maybe no. Okay, the third thing is to come back to the Security Council and say, look, we want to declare a state. We want your blessing for a state within the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as a capital. Well, most countries in the world have already conveyed their willingness to support such a decision, including almost all European countries. And all members of the UN Security Council, with the exception of the US, which is not sure, hasn't said much about the East Jerusalem as a capital of the Palestinian state. And it's not clear that it can or will allow the UN Security Council to vote. But that's what the Palestinians are hoping for, that the decision to go to the UN Security Council would be Arabized, and therefore the administration will be reluctant to say no to it, and that this will further strengthen the Palestinian case for state in the absence of negotiations. Palestinians also look at how Palestinian public opinion favors internationalization. More than 3/4 of the Palestinians strongly support taking the Palestinian case to the UN instead in the absence of negotiations. The third element in the Palestinian strategy is unilateralism. To take unilateral decisions in the relationship with Israel, including if going to the UN Security Council doesn't work because of US veto, then the Palestinians will unilaterally declare a state and see how the international community will react to it. Perhaps Palestinians would, as a result of that declaration, decide to extend their control into areas that in the West Bank that they consider part of their state, and to extend the Palestinian jurisdiction over such areas which might put them in conflict with the Israelis. And Palestinians hope that this will create an environment where the Israelis have to move forward and then that the international community would then intervene, and so on. So the idea of unilateralism, something that was banned in the Oslo Agreement, is gaining grounds among Palestinians. Finally, the final element in the Palestinian strategy is what Palestinians call the effort to wage campaign against the legitimacy or to delegitimize occupation. Israelis say this is a campaign to delegitimize Israel. Palestinians are careful to point out this is not to delegitimize Israel. It is to delegitimize decisions that are made by the Israeli government related to the peace process, decisions that are related to the continued Israeli occupation. This campaign the Palestinians want to wage at a global level. It's not just an internal campaign, and it involves a lot of elements. Some of those elements are not fully supported by the Palestinian leadership, but within this context of a sort of globalized delegitimation of occupation, Palestinians are willing to encourage things that they do not even believe in, the Palestinian leadership, I mean. It includes taking legal and judicial steps. Palestinians go to all kinds of courts in all the world to bring Israeli officials, ministers to justice, charging them with war crimes. Just during the last week, 2 Israeli ministers couldn't travel to Europe, one to Spain and one to England, because in these 2 countries, Palestinians went to courts in these 2 countries against these 2 ministers, accusing them of war crimes, and the 2 decided, therefore, to stay home rather than travel. Palestinians want to do a lot more of that. A boycott and divestment campaign. It's both domestic, boycott of Israeli settlements, products that could lead to other boycott forms, and at the international level. And Palestinians want to encourage this kind. Non-violent resistance in places in the West Bank. But while the places are the West Bank, Palestinians are hoping and are in fact working on bringing an international force, people, supporters of Palestinians, to these places in the West Bank to stand up to Israeli soldiers who are protecting work, for example, on the wall, the separation barrier that the Israelis are building inside the West Bank. In Bil'in, Na'lin, in Silwan, Sheikh Jarrah, etc. The one-state solution. Although the Palestinian leadership strongly opposes the one-state solution, and although the majority of the Palestinian public is opposed to one-state solution, nonetheless, the one-state solution is something that the Palestinian leadership is willing to encourage the talk about as another way of delegitimating occupation. The Free Gaza movement is another element in delegitimating occupation. The messages that come out of this campaign are messages that present Israeli occupation as creating a system of apartheid, committing war crimes, building illegal settlements, and so on and so forth. Why are things bleak then? I mean, Palestinians seem to be thinking about the future. They have all these ideas. None of them will work. None of them will change reality for Palestinians a single iota. They will actually make conditions for Palestinians much more intolerable. And that's all it takes to change the reality of Palestinians today, from no support to violence to a significant level of support for violence. And that is what I believe is coming. The Palestinians will spend the next 2 years flirting with all these ideas, with all these strategies, only to discover that they are going nowhere. Life in the West Bank will become more and more tougher for Palestinians because of the Israeli measures against these steps. And we will see a buildup of support for violence. I'll give you an example. In the middle of the Intifada, we decided to do an experiment. There were many Israeli checkpoints throughout the West Bank. So when we do our own surveys of public opinion, we go to inside the home, we sit in the living room, we drink tea and coffee with people, and we ask them questions. So they're very comfortable listening to music in the background and chatting about things. And we decided, while we were doing that, we're also going to go to the Israeli checkpoints where people are waiting in line to gain access to the next road. And we wanted to see whether, in fact, standing in the at the checkpoint makes a difference in terms of changing people's attitude. What kind of psychological developments we see on that individual sitting at the checkpoint. So we've asked the question that we've been asking at that time. This is in the middle of the Intifada, so this is the worst environment in terms of support for violence. Do you support or oppose suicide bombings against Israeli civilians inside Israel? That's the worst kind of terrorism, the worst kind of violence that the Palestinians were committing, and we're asking about it. Violence against civilians inside Israel. There's no ifs and buts about it. And inside the homes, support was 55%. Again, this is the worst time, so there was a lot of support for violence at that time. At the checkpoints, 95%. That's just a small experiment to show the extent to which you can build by changing the reality, you can build a constituency for violence. You are not likely to do that. You're not likely to build a constituency for non-violence this way. You're not likely to build a constituency for internationalization or Arabization or anything else. That is the sort of most effective way of building a constituency for violence. And that, I believe, is where we're heading, and that's why I believe the future is bleak, even though, as I started with, I see we are in a much better situation of making peace, given the international environment, the domestic environment, and the leaders on the Palestinian side, at least, where peace is most feasible. And thank you very much.
Questions?
Yes.
But you were talking about internalization, and you were expressing strong belief in the U.S. intervention, if I'm not mistaken. But I would like you to say something about the role of the UN in the peace process. Does it matter at all? I mean, because it's actually the international presence in the region, and it's supposed to be, facilitating the talks and the peace processes. I mean, is it doing anything? Is anything happening towards that? Because, I mean, the UNTSO is there since 1948 for a reason and a cause.
Internationalization in the eyes of the Palestinians in this strategy, the 4-point strategy that I talked about, is about working with UN institutions, most prominently with the UN Security Council to try and get the UN Security Council to play a role in recognizing, in terms of, in the Palestinian eyes, changing the reality. Settlements reality, recognizing a state, defining the borders of 1967, Jerusalem as a capital. So Palestinians hope that if this becomes the consensus of the international community and Israel is so isolated, if the U.S. is part of the process, then this might be effective. And of course, not all Palestinians believe that this will be effective. I mean, the overwhelming majority supports this approach, supports going to the UN Security Council. But the overwhelming majority also doesn't believe that this will be effective. And I don't believe it will be effective. I can't see the U.S. supporting such a decision when the Israeli government is opposed to it. I can't see the U.S. not intervening with a veto decision against any decision that would dramatically change conditions on the ground, and certainly not a recognition of a state within the 1967 borders with Jerusalem as a capital. So I think the idea that the international community can act in a manner that would be different than a U.S. foreign policy is not realistic. Whatever U.S. foreign policy is able to do, in my view, is the limit for international organizations. And certainly this is not the case for the General Assembly, where the U.S. does not have a veto. And there is no doubt that the U.S. will not care, however, about decisions, or Israel, that are made in the UN General Assembly. So I think this might be effective in contributing further to the Palestinian goal of delegitimating occupation. But I don't think it will give the Palestinians a state or change conditions on the ground.
And future of commercial relationships between Israel and West Bank?
I see in the short to mid-term, assuming that, I sort of assume that negotiations are going to go nowhere and that they might not even restart. If that is the case, and Palestinians do make significant moves in the direction of the 4-point strategy that I've indicated, then this will definitely affect the level of commercial exchange between Palestinians and Israelis. What now started as a boycott of the settlements product could very well expand to include other products in Israel. Palestinians already feel the Palestinians are not going to completely boycott Israeli products. This is simply not realistic. They recognize that they rely on, for 95% of the things they consume, they rely on Israeli products. And so they are a captive Israel for Israel. This has been the case for the last 50 years, and so they really have no choice but to continue to rely on Israel. But there might be a selective kind of boycott for certain products that they might embark on. And the Israeli response most likely will be to ban products entering Israel from Gaza, from the West Bank or Gaza. There isn't much coming from Gaza anyway. And that will certainly have a further impact on what Palestinians do with the boycott and so on. So there could be very well a kind of boycott war waged between the two sides as part of this strategy that I spoke about. That's my expectation. If you're a little bit more optimistic about where the peace process is heading than me, then My answer would be different if I had different expectations. I think in a context of a successful peace process, Palestinian-Israeli commercial interaction are likely to expand even further. That is where the overwhelming majority of the Palestinian business community, by the way, the overwhelming majority of the Palestinian business community believes the Palestinian economy should remain linked to the Israeli economy somehow. They want independence, political independence, but they also support continued Israeli-Palestinian economic interaction. And this, by the way, is also where the Palestinian public is, surprisingly. 2/3 of the Palestinian public supports, in a context of peace, at least 2/3 of the Palestinian public supports joint economic ventures, joint economic exchange between Palestinians and Israelis. Yes.
Two related questions. One, the role of the U.S. in the negotiations. Isn't it totally compromised by the $3 billion a year military aid to Israel? My second question is, when I listen to commentators about Palestine and Israel, it seems invariably that factor, the $3 billion a year of military aid to Israel, doesn't get mentioned. I'm trying to understand why. Because for me, it's the elephant in the living room.
Is it just $3 billion? Palestinians think it's a lot more than that. Palestinians, the thing that requires explanation is why, despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of the Palestinians, more than 90% of the Palestinians believe the U.S. is fully biased in favor of Israel. Yet when we ask them, actually we ask serious questions. We start with, is the U.S. Whose interests is the U.S. supporting? And very clearly they say, Palestinians say Israel. And only probably 3% will say Palestinians are the ones that the U.S. favors. When we then ask the Palestinians, should the U.S., would you support or oppose a strong U.S. intervention in the peace process between Palestinians and Israelis? More than 2/3 of the Palestinians say yes, definitely. We even complicate things for the public. We ask the Palestinian public, if the U.S. intervenes strongly in the peace process, will this help Israel or the Palestinians? Overwhelming majority says Israel. So Palestinians seem to think diplomacy is the way to go, at least for now, until they regain trust in violence. While they still believe violence is no good, they will continue to look at the U.S., despite their strong belief in its bias in favor of Israel. They will still look at the U.S. as a way to move the peace process forward.
That doesn't explain why
the U.S. stake in Israeli security doesn't seem to get mentioned in the commentary. Whereas it's a very real factor, isn't it? Why not help enlighten the U.S. public to the realities, the geopolitical realities there?
The Israeli public?
No, the U.S. public.
The U.S. public?
I think we live in a bubble here. We're ignorant of the realities in Palestine and Israel.
The U.S. Congress that you elect doesn't know that the U.S. takes all this money from its taxpayer and give it to Israel? Come on. Yes.
So, hypothetical scenario, and somehow the government can actually cut a deal with Israel. Would it be possible for a peace deal between Fatah and the West Bank and Israel and not Gaza? I guess where would that situation leave the Gaza Strip? If it's not possible to have a peace deal only with Fatah and only with regard to the West Bank and not the Gaza Strip, how is negotiation possible without Fatah-Hamas rapprochement?
One issue, because of the time limits, I didn't dwell on much, is the question of the impact of Fatah-Hamas competition and the current separation on the future of the peace process. Except to say that the fact that Fatah doesn't want reconciliation at the moment pushes Fatah to seek alternative means for legitimacy. The prevailing perception among the nationalists is when you are weak, and the nationalists are weak, if the peace process is going nowhere. That means you've put all your money on something and you came out a loser. Nationalists believe you don't then turn around to your opponents and make a deal with them from a point of weakness. And so the nationalists do not want to turn to Hamas and reconcile with Hamas with the background of a failure in negotiations. Instead, first of all, there is, of course, the strong belief that negotiations are going nowhere. And so the idea that somehow you're going to make peace with Fatah in the West Bank and you really have a problem with Hamas in Gaza is not seen as a realistic scenario. However, the nationalists believe if this is indeed a realistic scenario, then we will make the price necessary in terms of concessions to Hamas after we reach a peace agreement to make unification of the West Bank and Gaza a realistic goal. And that requires concessions on the part of Fatah, but that would then come on the background of a successful peace process, one that gives the nationalists the legitimacy and public support they need. In that case, the nationalists will make the concessions Hamas needs in order to agree to the terms of reunification and the going to the public for new elections, which would then be a referendum on the peace process. Whoever wins the elections then determine what to do about the peace process. That is how nationalists view that kind of unlikely scenario in which there is a peace agreement reached with Fatah in the West Bank and what would then be required in order to bring in the Islamists into the picture.
Does your poll data suggest sort of systematic differences in public opinion with regard to the peace process in Gaza and the West Bank? Or is the ideology more of a difference in leadership?
We don't see any differences in terms of willingness to compromise. Both West Bank and Gaza have a significant majorities in favor of a two-state solution. And even when it comes to the specific compromises required in refugees, holy places, security, and so on, we also don't see significant variations between West Bank and Gaza. Where we see significant variations are related to violence. Gazans tend to support violence. There is actually a majority of Gazans today who believe that the West Bank should embark on violence against the Israelis. West Bankers are opposed strongly to that. 2/3 of the West Bankers oppose violence today, while a majority of Gazans support violence today.
You referred to the Hamas violent takeover of Gaza. And I was wondering, I'm sure you're aware that a lot of Palestinians would disagree with that characterization.
Sure.
And I wonder if you could talk a little about the role of, as I remember it, and correct me if I'm wrong here, a lot of the authority that Abu Mazen has and Arafat had stemmed from their control of the security forces and the money that comes from both Europe and the United States and is funneled to the security forces. Now, after Hamas won the election, their position was that they should control the security forces.
Yes.
So, I mean, so what I wonder if you could say a little about, I mean, before the takeover, General Keith Dayton of the United States was training Fatah security forces in Jordan. And to a lot of people, this thing looked like a coup, right? So I wonder if you could just talk a little about that, and I wonder if you could explain what the Palestinian perception of General Keith Dayton is, and the relationship, of his position, and also, the interesting relationship between the Israeli security forces and the Fatah security forces. Which looks to a lot of Palestinians as collusion and suppression of legitimate dissent.
You're right. Many Palestinians do not view the Hamas takeover of Gaza as a violent takeover or as an illegal takeover, or do not view it in negative terms. But the overwhelming majority of Palestinians do oppose what Hamas did. Including most of Hamas supporters. And the violent part, which you're reluctant to embrace, is actually embraced is considered to be a dimension of the conflict. That there were hundreds of Palestinians who were killed during the takeover is not something that Palestinians can run away from. And that some of these deaths occurred in a manner that Palestinians do not approve of is something that very well known to the Palestinian public. Most Palestinians believe Hamas did something wrong when it took over Gaza violently. But they do agree with you that Hamas should have taken control of the security services. The Palestinian political system is one that was being rewritten. In the early 2000s, there was a lot of Palestinian internal complaints about Arafat and his authoritarian control of various aspects of Palestinian political life, including the security services. And so there was a demand for accountability. The parliament was making these demands. There was public opinion in general, the civil society was demanding it, and then the international community demanded it. Now, there was a difference between the two. The Palestinians demanded it because of accountability they felt was lacking, and they wanted accountability. They wanted someone who can be brought in front of a parliament and have to justify his or her action. And because Arafat was directly elected by the people, somehow he considered himself immune from this kind of accountability. And so they wanted a prime minister, someone who is not directly elected by the public and who would be brought to accountability. And so Arafat finally agreed to the demand for a prime minister, and the Palestinian constitution was rewritten to include transfer of control of some of the security services, not all of them, to the Prime Minister's office. However, unfortunately, this process of sort of rewriting the legal terms of who controls what are the limits or the boundaries of jurisdiction for the president versus the prime minister, the security services remain very, very problematic. You have a president, according to the basic law and the laws related to the security services, who is appointed by the president. But then the new edition basically said he's accountable to the interior minister. So this kind of confusion in an environment in which there was total collapse of central government. We're talking about a period in which this was done all in a theoretical manner. In reality, the security services have been totally disintegrated. At that same time, when these laws were being rewritten, Fatah was in control, but Fatah was forming its own militias all over, using the security services, warlords. Fatah was divided into warlords, and Hamas had its own militia, of course. And so even assuming the best of conditions, assuming that who won the election was not Hamas but Fatah, and a prime minister from Fatah was elected to lead the government, that government would not have had real control over the security services because of the fragmentation on the one hand, and secondly, because of the ambiguity in legal and constitutional terms over the jurisdiction of the various actors in the political system. I think Hamas misjudged that kind of ambiguity and interpreted what was happening in a manner that created a lot of threat perception within Hamas. General Dayton was stationed in the West Bank and started functioning in December 2005, just before Hamas won the elections. However, there was no training of Palestinian security forces before Hamas's takeover of Gaza by General Dayton. 500 men from Fatah were sent to Egypt a few months before Hamas's takeover of Gaza for training, probably just 3 months before the Hamas takeover. And by the time Hamas took over Gaza, they haven't yet returned to Gaza. And so the idea that there was something building and that General Dayton or the Americans were behind it, while I read a lot about it in the American press, is something that I personally believe is highly exaggerated. But if you are a Hamas leader and you saw that as a prime minister you really didn't have a great, not much really, control over the security services, you would be paranoid too.
For a minute about the Geneva Agreement from 2003. And I know that in Israel, that agreement was photocopied and sent to every mailbox with major donations from Europe to do that. How was it received in Palestine, and in particular the agreement by the Palestinian delegation to recognize Israel as a homeland for the Jewish people, that particular element to the agreement? So that's one question I have. And the second question that I have is, I'm very taken by your polling in the homes versus the checkpoints. And, to me, it does suggest that Israel holds the cards in a way that if it acts in ways that are brutalizing of the Palestinian population, it will create the kind of violent response. And we see that in the 1990s, that as leftist Israeli governments, Peres, people say if Rabin had remained alive, he would have done the same. Very sort of these aggressive countermeasures that really, destroyed the livelihoods and day-to-day lives of Palestinians. And that over time, in your poll data, which I've looked at, increased the willingness to use terror violence against Israel. So how to prevent the checkpoints is, I think, the key here. How to prevent that kind of Israeli response. And in my view, the only way to do that really is to empower the Israeli left of center. To empower that portion of the Israeli electorate that doesn't want to do these kinds of things. And so I'm wondering, in your work and in your polling and in your knowledge of the PA, who is in charge of trying to reach out to the Israeli left? Is there any sort of attempt to develop strategies, not to reach the international community, but to reach the Israeli left in sort of a similar way that Anwar Sadat tried to do, go over these intransigent politicians, the Begins, and speak directly to the Israeli people?
You've asked many questions. I'll try to answer all of them if I can. On the Geneva was first made public in 2003. And this was in the middle of the Intifada, in the middle of the Israeli reoccupation of the West Bank. And so Palestinian reaction was not positive. In addition, of course, the Palestinian public was still deliberating what needs to be done after the collapse of Camp David. And some of this deliberation had to do with whether violence is as effective as Palestinians think and so on. And so Geneva came right at that time, which wasn't a great time, therefore, for the unveiling of this comprehensive agreement. A second deficiency in Geneva is that it was the leadership that signed the document and that presented it to the Palestinian public came from a very small fringe left-wing Palestinian faction. And the Palestinian public also perceived the Israeli counterparts to also come from a small fringe of left-wing Israelis. And so it wasn't considered to be a serious undertaking. And so when we first did a survey among the Palestinian public about it, less than 40% of the Palestinians supported it. However, this was 2003. By 2005, when we took the elements in the Geneva Agreement, which were pretty much similar to the Clinton parameters, and when we sort of isolated them and didn't say this is Geneva, and didn't say this is the Clinton parameters, we simply said, okay, a permanent status agreement is signed, these are the compromises that the two sides have agreed to. Do you support these compromises, and then do you support the package? We've, since 2003, actually, we've been asking the Israeli and Palestinian publics about this, an identical question to Israelis and Palestinians consistently at least once every year since 2003. The best time for support came in 2005. This was, for both Israeli and Palestinian publics, was a year of optimism somehow. For Palestinians, this came right after Arafat died, and the election of Abu Mazen, the expectation that Abu Mazen, the man of peace, is going to bring peace. The level of optimism skyrocketed, and our surveys consistently show that there is a strong correlation, positive correlation, between optimism and support for compromise. The higher optimism, the higher support for compromise. And so that was the year. Since then, we have seen ups and downs in support for these compromises. I would say today about half of the Palestinian public, a little half at times, support these compromises. The other half is opposed. In Israel, we see a little bit more support for these compromises than among the Palestinian public, among Israeli public. On the Jewish character of the state, again, actually, we started, before Geneva came about, the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Ariel Sharon, raised this issue and demanded there was a meeting to take place with President Bush visiting Jordan by the Dead Sea between Sharon, Abu Mazen, who was then at that moment appointed prime minister by Arafat, and President Bush. And at that meeting, Sharon raised the demand that the Palestinians, this was the first time ever that an Israeli leader raised the issue of the Jewish character of the state. And Abu Mazen and the Palestinian leadership in general said, we don't care what is the nature, what character, national character your state takes. That's your business. We're not going to say we recognize you as a Jewish state. We recognize you as a state, like any other state, the state of Israel. We've done that already. Why are you asking us to recognize your national character? We're not asking you to recognize our national character. And Palestinians, of course, had other concerns, very, very serious concerns about the recognition of the Jewish nature of the state, because they believe that this was a euphemism for denying the rights of the refugees, for discrimination against Israeli Arabs, and so on and so forth. So when we asked the Palestinian public, we were actually surprised by the fact that a little over 50% of the Palestinian public supported the recognition of the Jewish character of the state. And in fact, in 2005, 2/3 of the Palestinian public said yes. Now, when we, however, presented this compromise, it was there were two dimensions to it that were different from how the Israeli leadership presented the demand. The Israeli leadership presented the demand as sort of a precondition for negotiations, or something that comes very early in the process of negotiations. We told the Palestinian public that when all issues of the conflict are addressed and resolved, would you recognize the Jewish character of the state? The second element, where we framed the question differently, was, again, this was asked of both Israelis and Palestinians. We've asked the question we framed the question in terms of mutual recognition of the national character of the two states. Israelis recognize the national character of the state of Palestine. Palestinians recognize the national character of the state of Israel. And so in that context, we found a majority in the 2005. There was more than 2/3 support among Israelis and about 2/3 support among Palestinians for that mutual recognition of the Jewish character of the state. Just a little over 3 months ago, that support was about 55%. I'm not sure I have the precise figure, among Palestinians. In a survey we published just a month ago, or a little than a month ago, support has gone down to 50% or so. There are ups and downs here. I think it is more related to what Palestinians hear from Israelis and how they interpret the demand. We say to the public in the surveys, again, that it is mutual and that it comes at the end of the process. What they hear from the Israeli leaders, that it's not mutual. And secondly, it doesn't come at the end of the process. For that reason, when we now go back to the public and ask about it, they frame our question in terms of what they hear from the Israeli leaders, and so we begin to see more opposition to it. If I were advising the Israeli leaders, I would say stop it. If you want Palestinians to recognize the Jewish nature of the state, it has to be done in a different manner. In fact, Palestinian public opinion provides an opportunity, not a constraint, on Palestinian leaders in terms of that recognition. But it cannot be done the way the Israeli leaders are demanding it.
Any more questions?
No more questions.
Okay, then I would ask you to join us at Park for pizza and informal conversation if you would like. That's in 400 Eggers. And with that, thank you very much, and please join me in thanking you.